Right then, this is the biological explanations for OCD. This is for AS level, just in case any of my year 13s have stumbled over this. Apologies in advance, there's quite a lot of background noise as I'm recording this, so I hope you're able to hear it all right. Now, when we look at OCD, we're going to look at two different types of biological explanation. The first one is genes, genetic explanations, and the second one is neural, which means to do with the brain. So in this video, I'm actually only going to give you the genetic explanations and not even any evaluation, because there's quite a lot of new content within this. Now, your task, what I want you to do, as I go through this, you're going to find that there's words in bold. I've given you a box on your worksheet for each of these to complete, and what I want you to do is, as well as making notes, is learn what all of these new words mean, because there's a lot of new vocab with this topic. And then if there's any others that aren't in bold that you didn't know, obviously feel free to put them in as well. But that's the key thing that you need to do today, is learn all of these new words and what they mean. And I'll test that in the lesson. So let's start talking about genetic explanations. And this explanation was identified as long ago, right back in 1936, ages and ages ago. And this is a psychiatrist who looked at his OCD patients, and he found that 37% of them had parents with OCD and 21% had siblings with OCD. That's quite a high rate. So that suggests that we've got some form of genetic cause. Now, it's not as simple as you get this gene and then therefore you get OCD, as you'll see as we talk through this. But what you basically do in this case is pass on what's called a genetic vulnerability. And that basically means that if you have certain genes, then you're predisposed to getting OCD. It means that you are more likely to get it. It doesn't mean you will get it, but it means that you might get it. You're more likely to get it than someone else. And what we often talk about in this kind of situation is something called the diathesis stress model. And this is used for loads of different mental illnesses, not just OCD. But what this is all about is, it says basically, if you've got a genetic predisposition, so if you've got like certain genes that make you more likely to get a mental illness, and then you encounter some kind of environmental stress or trigger or something, that can then lead to a mental illness. So let me give you a couple of examples of that. Let's imagine you're genetically predisposed to have a depression, for example. Let's imagine that you're doing fine despite this, you haven't got depression, and then there's some kind of massive stress, like you suffer a bereavement. That can then trigger your mental illness, because you have a genetic predisposition and you've also encountered an environmental stress that can set it off. So that could in that case mean you get depression. We say the same kind of thing for OCD, that you have a genetic vulnerability and then maybe you encounter some kind of environmental stress, stress at work or something like that, and that can trigger your OCD. Okay, right, let's talk about specifics of OCD and genes. So they have actually found some genes that cause this vulnerability, and a candidate gene is any gene thought likely to cause a disease. So they've identified various different candidate genes. And this is something they talk about again with lots of mental illnesses, candidate genes. Anyway, some of these ones that they found for OCD are involved in controlling serotonin in the brain, and I'll show you a bit more about that on the next slide. But here's an example. They've actually identified this one, 5-HT1D beta. You might actually put that in your glossary. It helps efficiency of serotonin transport across synapses. I told you there was a lot of new words for this one. So let's have a look at a synapse. I don't know if you've done this before for biology at GCSE. What this is just to give you a bit of background. This is in the brain. This is what we call a presynaptic neuron. And this is the signal in a brain cell would travel this way. And what it has to do is it travels through your brain cell and then it has to go across what we call the synapse, this gap between the neurons, and it has to carry on along the next brain cell. And we call this the postsynaptic neuron. So you've got the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. And what happens here, serotonin is actually what we call a neurotransmitter, and that means that it helps to transmit signals across the synapse. Now you can see this is the serotonin. What happens is it's released into the synapse, it's transmitted across, it binds to receptors on the other side, and then it's released off again, and it goes back, it's taken back into the presynaptic neuron through a certain port. So if we go back to OCD, if you've got a gene that that helps the efficiency of serotonin transport across synapses, if that gene for whatever reason isn't working properly, then your serotonin is probably going to be moving more slowly and less efficiently across the synapse, so it's going to be binding less to these receptors on the other side. And low serotonin levels is actually something that in the synapse is actually something that has been linked to OCD, but we'll talk about that more with the neural explanations. That's just really for you to make sure that you understand what I'm talking about with this, the fact that these genes have some kind of role with serotonin and that they help serotonin to be efficient. So that's the first detail, is this 5-HT1D beta, that they've actually identified that one that's linked to it. And then another thing is that OCD is actually polygenic. So that means it's not caused by one single gene, several are involved. I mean, we've already said it's not as simple as you have this gene and therefore you get it. But you can see it's even more complex than that. It's not even a case of, oh, you've got that gene, so you're more likely to be vulnerable. It's some kind of combination of lots of different genes. So Taylor actually found evidence, this very recent study, evidence for 230 different genes possibly being involved. That doesn't mean every person who gets OCD has 230 defective genes, not at all. But it does mean that it's really, maybe at some point in the future we'll be able to predict who will get it, but as of now you can see how incredibly complex that would be if different people with OCD have got different combinations of these 230 different genes kind of working to make a vulnerability for their OCD. And a number of these ones, again, are genes that regulate both serotonin and dopamine, which is also another neurotransmitter. A neurotransmitter is something that helps signals to be transmitted across the synapse. Okay, carrying on then, in terms of OCD, the different types of OCD might be caused by different gene variants. So in terms of what we mean by different types of OCD, things like hoarding is quite different from like the religious obsession kind, or like the obsession with cleanliness kind of OCD. So you've got quite a lot of different variants of OCD, and that might be because they have different combinations of genes working behind the scenes. And the other thing is that one group of genes might cause OCD in one person, while a different group of genes might cause the disorder in another person. Okay, so what that means, the term for that, another great term for you to learn, etiologically heterogeneous. Etiology is to do with the cause of something, that's what it means, how it's caused. Heterogeneous, different genes. Hetero, if you think about heterosexual, that means different sexes. Hetero, different genes, genus. So etiologically heterogeneous. Okay, so that's all that I'm putting on here. What you need to do is make sure that with all those new keywords you're confident with what they mean before the lesson. So it's a case of writing them down and learning them. Do yourself flashcards if that helps. You can see the number that you've got in there: genetic vulnerability, diathesis stress, candidate genes, serotonin, synapses. You might even have postsynaptic and presynaptic neurons, polygenic. So you've got absolutely tons of new keywords. So please make sure that you understand those and have learnt those before the lesson.